I'm Tishan, and I'm currently the global focal point for the Global Humanitarian Youth Platform under MGCY, and also working with the Ministry of Health of Malaysia as a license officer for Women's Health Initiative in Hospital Cyberjaya. So I think what I'll be covering more would be on where are we currently in the Asia-Pacific region in terms of human rights and also humanitarian action. And I have actually kind of picked up a few aspects that are pretty relevant now, especially in the last 10 years. So next slide. So I think the first one would be political instability and also armed conflicts. Prolonged conflicts, especially in areas such as Afghanistan, Myanmar, and also parts of the Philippines, has actually led to human rights being violated. And these conflicts hinder humanitarian access, leading to gaps in the work that we do. So for example, speaking on the Rohingya crisis in 2017, there were more than 700,000 Rohingya refugees fleeing to Bangladesh since then. And it was one of the biggest and the largest humanitarian crises in the region. Therefore, I think diplomatic effort for conflict resolution, supporting for peace processes, strengthening capacity of local actors to deliver humanitarian aid and anti-corruption is key. And I would also like to highlight the work being done by the Transparency International Asia Pacific's program that actually works in the region, especially in Indonesia and India, that actually works around combating corruption and also enhancing governance through capacity building, advocacy, and also grassroots mobilization. So moving on to the next slide. Speaking on discrimination and marginalization, so minority groups, people with disabilities, they often face discrimination. And what happens is the existing human rights challenges are also exacerbated here. For example, the indigenous people in India and also the Pacific Islands, they often face discrimination, limiting them from getting access to basic services like healthcare, education, and also disaster relief efforts. So the intervention that I'd like to propose, of course, in anything that we do, policy should be inclusive, enhancing legal protections for marginalized groups, and also when we're planning for any humanitarian work, any humanitarian action, I think we should also take into consideration of the cultural sensitivity there. And also, I would like to highlight the work being done by the Namatis Legal Empowerment that works in the Asia-Pacific region, especially in Myanmar and India. They work in legal empowerment for the marginalized groups. And what they do is they train paralegals to help people understand how they can use the law to secure basic needs, such as land ownership, access to basic services, and also protection against abuses. Up next. Speaking on disaster preparedness and response. So I think Asia-Pacific region is known, are more prone for natural disasters, the typhoon, floods, earthquakes, etc., even the recent earthquake. What has happened here is I think we are challenged with resources, we are challenged with capacity, we are challenged with finance. And when we are faced with any natural disasters, what happens? The ASEAN Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance on Disaster Management, especially in the region, they cooperate regionally among the ASEAN state members, having a platform for shared resources and also shared, initiatives. So targeted aid for the most vulnerable, social protection mechanisms, having that in place, and also having a post-recovery efforts are also key when it comes to disaster preparedness. Another thing, ensuring that the disaster risk reduction strategies are integrated, especially when it's planning, integrating humanitarian planning, and also human rights principles are also important to ensure that the marginalized groups and also those who are vulnerable, especially the elderly, the women, and also children are not left behind. Next. Refugee protection and humanitarian space, yeah. So in most countries, I mean, some countries I would say, especially countries like Cambodia and Thailand, the governments have actually restricted civil society organizations, NGOs, from being able to freely work, especially when it comes to humanitarian, which means you've got to be in contact with the government in case of any disasters or any humanitarian response. Therefore, the interventions that I would like, especially for those grassroots, we have to protect the space of humanitarian advocacy. International pressures on governments to uphold basic human rights are important, and also to make sure that legal frameworks are important so that civil society organizations and humanitarian organizations are well taken care of and they're free to work without having any fear. And here I would like to highlight UNHCR's regional refugee response plan for the Rohingya refugees. So UNHCR, along with other UN agencies and NGOs, they actually lead a multi-country response system that provides supports to the Rohingya refugees, providing them with shelter, education, healthcare, and also protection plans. So that's also another intervention by UNHCR that I would like to highlight. And I think my last slide, I assume, yes. Promoting gender equality and combating gender-based violence. So I think this, when it comes to any humanitarian action, something that we often miss out is how do we integrate or how do we include gender analysis when we plan for any humanitarian response, especially in its framework. You also got to enhance protection measures to make sure that these vulnerable groups are safe, and to increase public awareness with community engagement and also empowerment. So I would like to highlight initiative by UN Women on Safe Cities and Safe Public Spaces initiatives, where they have worked in Papua New Guinea and also New Delhi in India by providing better safety measures, for example, better lighting in streets, keeping safe spaces for women in transport hubs and especially in markets. Basically, this is just basically to address sexual harassment and also keeping this place safe for girls and women. So in conclusion, I think to basically close the gap of human rights and humanitarian action, I think we need a multifaceted approach. And that only can be done if we have a strong international and global cooperation, and also local engagement, and also making sure that everyone who's at the power tackle this issue. Yeah, I think that's all for me. Thank you.
All right, without further ado, we'll be moving on to our next panelist. We are joined by Sivananthi Thanenthiran from Arrow. Siva is the Executive Director of Asia Pacific Resource and Research Center for Women, a regional feminist organization in the Asia Pacific region. Siva will bring in light the status of SDG indicators on gender equality and SRHR in the region. So, Siva?
So actually the topic that I was given was, what is the progress towards gender equality, and what are perhaps some of the setbacks, or what are the issues that have arisen. So I'm going to stand up because I feel very uncomfortable, like standing down here. Okay, sitting. Okay, so basically, firstly, what do we understand by SDGs on gender equality, right? What do you all think as gender equality? And gender equality was an agenda that came from the 80s. We know that some of you think that these are perhaps, outdated concepts to kind of capture what our reality is, right? And in gender equality, what has the fight of gender equality been about? So I wanted to just maybe share with you a little bit of history around gender equality and the feminist movement. So you all have Google, right? You should search this song called Bread and Roses. So Bread and Roses was like, the song sung by women's rights activists who are marching through the streets. Okay, and within those lyrics, you will find that we don't march for women alone, because when we march for women, we're also marching for men. You know why? Because men are also our fathers, and they're also our sons, right? And for some of us, they're also our spouses or partners. So men and women fight for gender equality together, and gender equality benefits both the sexes and people of diverse sex and gender identities as well, right? So this is what gender equality in his holistic concept is about, okay? And I think that when we talk about gender equality, if we took the SDG indicators alone, and the SDGs, I think somebody was talking, Yeah, it was our young person, Sangeet, who was telling us how the SDGs came from the MDGs, and the MDGs were very, few. And the SDGs went a few steps further, right? But basically, it was about economic rights of women, it's about political participation, as well as SRHR, because it's within that gender equality goal that we have actually seen in accordance with reproductive rights as per the ICPD program of action, right? So these are the things enshrined in gender equality. And that is why that song goes, bread and roses. Why? Because we want bread, but we also want roses, right? Because life is not only about the things that we need, but it's also about the things that we aspire for and we dream about, So for us, what does gender equality mean? It is that all of us, especially these marginalized groups and vulnerable groups, of which a large proportion of them are women and girls, right? Everyone has that aspiration and deserves the right to bread, and we deserve the right to have our roses, right? And so every time we go into a development framework, and then so now we have the SDGs, and then I think in 2030 we'll have, SDG plus, whatever, right? So every time we go into the international scenario, we're trying to define what is going to be our bread and what is going to be our roses, okay? So keep that in mind as you move forward, okay? So where have really been the challenges to gender equality? I think the progress, you know very well. I mean, it takes a really crappy man in power to say that, girls shouldn't go to school. I mean, but guess what? We have now seen such crappy men come to power as well, right? It takes some really very bad, how can people say today in 2020, women should not go out to work, right? Nobody can say that. I mean, you can't say that without looking like a very outdated, backwards, crappy person, right? But there are still persons will then say, well, you should stay at home and that is your role. And that's an elevated role that we give for women. Yeah, well, you can give any role, but who gets the right to decide, right? So the person who decides about these choices needs to be the individual, right? So where we have seen the real issues come around is definitely, and you can see it center, left, and right in all our societies. It is about autonomy and agency of women, because, of course, they want women and girls to continue to perform, the world's, I wouldn't even say the region's, labor for free, right? So the first challenge is the care burden. We saw this during COVID, right? And even I struggled with it, because in every household, it was the women and girls who had to do multiple tasks. And at that point, when the state failed, the state failed, right? So education came into the household. Whose role was that? Cooking came into the household like never before, right? And then making sure that people's healthcare needs came into the household, and who was responsible for it. And this, when the state fails, what we've seen is it only happened in COVID thus far. But I think in the previous panel, I think Dr. Julita mentioned the word polycrisis, because we are living in a world of polycrisis. It means that other crises can come to our doorsteps in a very fast span of time, right? The climate crisis. So in the climate crisis, when we face a climate emergency event, again, the state will fail. I mean, it doesn't fail permanently, but it'll fail temporarily, at least for 2 months, 3 months, 1 year, 2 years, like had happened during COVID. And then again, where does the burden of responsibility, where is it going to fall? Do we want to go into another crisis, having experienced what we've done during COVID and experience the exact same thing, maybe in an amplified way, right? So this is one. It is all about the care burden. The second thing about agency and autonomy is, of course, so many of the things, right? And I think you as young people know this, right? Governments and institutions will give out sexual and reproductive health and rights services for married women who are termed, are they good women, right? But not necessarily to young people, because you are engaging in relationships. And so every right that you have only comes about if your body conforms to what the rules and regulations in society are telling you, right? If you refuse to abide by the rules and regulations, then they sanction you or they leave you out. They leave you out of services, they leave you out of your... But the thing is, these are your rights, isn't it? If you are a citizen of the state, these are your rights. And nobody can take that away from you, right? So that's two. The third is, of course, the challenge of inclusion, right? And I think that you spoke a bit about it, you know, amongst women. Okay, so some of us are thinking we can claim our rights as citizens. Not always true, because if in some countries women are, how do I say, secondary citizens in many aspects of the way. Even if you go to a government department, people ask you, is your father with you or is your husband with you, right? Like, you cannot have the capacity to sign a document. In some countries, even like, I think it was 2 years ago in the Indian state of Kerala, where a Hindu girl married a Muslim boy, and she was above the age of majority. I think she was 22 or 23 years old. And yet, what the court decided to do is say like, oh, I don't think you should be marrying this Muslim boy. So you go now into the care of your parents. Can you imagine telling a grown-ass woman that you do not have the right to choose who you can love or who you can marry? And yet it is happening every single time, right? So when we talk about the marginalization of women from the ability to even exercise choices and decisions, with the most basic fundamental things like who to love, who to marry, how many children to have, when not to have children, these are the barriers that we face. And that's why SRHR is really, really integral. And it's really integral for you in your life. Because you know what? We can all go to school, you know, we can get a good job, right? We can live in a fairly secure home. So we've got all the bread, but we have no rose. And if we don't have those roses, then there's no meaning to our lives, right? So for me, I would say that even if we look at all of these issues, these are not just technical issues, you know, it's not about numbers. You know, and it's not like we want to hold governments accountable, right? Like as though we got nothing better to do, we're going to tell the government, you're doing a crappy job, do it better. We want to do other things in our life too, right? But always remember, and what looks like bread and roses, of course, I mean, please don't, son, because we do know that right now in our countries, there are many groups that don't even have bread. Of course, we have to have bread, you know, but I think that all I want to say is the roses are missing from our life, and our bodily autonomy and agency is very much lesser recognized, and that's why we fight for those rights as well. And these are the gaps in our region, which still, like, you know, everyone looks at all the bread that we have acquired, right? We have the roads, we have the trains, we have the buildings, you know, we have all of the bread. But although the bread is not equally shared, but the roses are few for us to talk about. And that's where we really need to make sure that we're building an agenda that is able to fulfill both of this, because both of them are important in our lives. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Siva. So finally, we have Ms. Robbie Halib, belongs to Kalangoya and Kankane indigenous people in the Cordillera region in the Philippines. She is the current coordinator of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group for Sustainable Development and the Right Energy Partnership with Indigenous People. Ms. Halib will be discussing the human rights and protection of environment and human rights defender, especially shedding light on Indigenous people. Ms. Robbie, would you like to start?
Thank you. Kindly confirm if my audio is clear.
Yes, Robbie, we can hear you.
It is? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity for us to be able to share just briefly on the work of the Right Energy Partnership with Indigenous Peoples. Wanted to share that our partner in Malaysia, they're based in Kota Kinabalu, Tonibong. The ones that are leading that initiative are indigenous youth, young engineers who are supporting communities to be able to operate and manage their own renewable energy initiatives. So the youth, indigenous youth, are playing a big role in not only advancing a just energy transition, but also climate justice. Now, in Asia, there's an estimate of around two-thirds of the world's indigenous peoples are in the region, no? And the most biodiverse areas are located in indigenous peoples' territories, while globally we are collectively called indigenous peoples. At the local and at the country level, we are called by we identify by our ethnicity. So if you noticed a while ago, I come from the Kalamuya and Kankanay indigenous peoples in the Cordillera region in the Philippines. It's from two indigenous groups here in the northern part of the Philippines. The same way that other indigenous peoples would be identifying based on their ethnicity in areas where they are located. Now, in terms of challenges that we face, no, in achieving sustainable development, one of the key challenge, not only in Asia but also in other regions, is the non-recognition of indigenous peoples as distinct peoples with collective rights. No, while in Asia we see some progress in terms of policies that are recognizing indigenous peoples' rights, such as the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act in the Philippines, the recognition of communal lands in Cambodia. The implementation of these laws and policies are still quite weak. There's lack of political will among governments to really implement their human rights obligation to indigenous peoples, particularly in implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The other key challenge that we are also facing is the imposition of development projects in our territories that is not aligned to our self-determined priorities. And most often, these projects are being implemented without our free, prior, and informed consent. We are not included in relation to decision making, and more so for youth and indigenous women. And what's worse is that when we defend our lands, our resources, and territories from these destructive projects, we face harassment, we face threats, and a number of times our indigenous leaders are also subjected to killings, disappearance, and also arrest. In the report of the frontline defenders, you would see that still the number one most of the human rights defenders are killed that were killed last year are coming from indigenous peoples. And there's also in the region the statelessness, no, of indigenous peoples when geopolitical boundaries were introduced among countries. The ancestral territories of indigenous peoples were divided, making them stateless in another country where they were located when geopolitical boundaries were introduced. No? And this is the case, for example, for a number of indigenous peoples who are currently in Thailand, who are in the border areas. There's also the increasing criminalization of indigenous people's traditional occupation and also health practices. No? In the Philippines, the traditional home birthing methods of indigenous peoples is being criminalized, and in Thailand and also in Cambodia, a number of indigenous peoples have already been arrested for practicing their traditional occupation. Now, particular for indigenous youth in terms of the challenge on access to education, the lack of culturally appropriate and mother tongue-based education. In the data gathering that we did, there's high enrollment for indigenous students at the primary level. When they reach secondary level, it becomes 20%, and only 1 or 2 will be able to reach tertiary level, and that's quite low, no? And this is impacted by one, the lack of integration of a mother tongue-based education, but also the high discrimination that indigenous peoples are still facing within the society, which also leads to a number of indigenous youth not wanting to identify us as indigenous peoples. But I think the bigger challenge also that indigenous youth and indigenous women are facing are also their lack of full and effective participation in decision-making processes within their community, but also in matters that are affecting them, such as laws and policies and programs that are being developed that are targeting them. No, it's more of what's being done is more of a top to bottom approach development for Indigenous women and youth than a bottom up approach. Now, last just key points on ways forward, no, on how we see how to strengthen the role of Indigenous youth in Indigenous people's movements. One, it's important that we continue the intergenerational learning among Indigenous peoples, Indigenous elders, and Indigenous youth, for the Indigenous youth to be able to carry on our tradition and our culture and be able to pass it on to the future generations. It's important also that decision-making processes within Indigenous communities and also with the wider society includes the full and effective participation of Indigenous youth and Indigenous women, and ensure that development plans integrates the particular needs and priorities of the youth and the women. And also support for Indigenous peoples-led initiatives, no? Especially initiatives of Indigenous youth to advance their self-determined development. As I mentioned earlier, we see the growing role of the youth in changing the status quo and also holding governments accountable. But our call also for the youth is, as we move forward with our struggles and our movements, we also have to be mindful of the struggles of those marginalized by the society, because sometimes calls that we push forward from the mainstream society are further marginalizing also Indigenous peoples, fisher folks, and farmers. So it's important to have an integration also with the different marginalized sectors within your country, within your communities, to also understand and be aware of the struggles that they have. And lastly, we owe it to the future generations to ensure that the continuity of our peoples and that the security of our land, resources, and territories are there for them to also enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you, Robbie. So now we'll directly move on to our young panel members. I know you have a lot of burning questions, but keep it for the end. So now I'd like to hand over to my co-moderator, Rijudi.
Thank you, Paulton. Thank you, our dear panelists, for taking on and setting the agenda and tone for us. Now we move on to our very exciting panel of young people who've been young advocates in their respective countries and will share with you their experiences and recommendations as well. As the recommendations keep coming, we also invite our audience to kindly take up the recommendation corners around and also put in your food for thoughts, your actions, your commitments around in the boards as well, so that we can, if there are questions that we have not been able to engage in this panel itself, we still have a look at them, get back on them through our youth call to action that's going to be developed in the later session as well. So moving on to our first young panelist, we have with us Pushpa from Nepal, who has an 8+ years of experience in SRHR, queer rights, and gender equality. She has also co-founded the organization Youth-Led SRHR Advocacy Nepal, Yoshan. Pushpa, please share with us your perspectives on the approaches and practices for advancing gender equality and SRHR through youth advocacy. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Riju, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'll be talking about my experience from Nepal about approaches and practices for advancing gender equality and SRHR through youth advocacy. So moving forward, talking about the progress. In my observation and my experience as well, these days there is a good increase of youth participation in the decision making, and a lot of platforms like RHRN and National Youth Councils and CAC advocacy coalitions are giving platforms to young people like us to participate in UN human rights mechanisms and related platforms, where we are being able to put our voices forward and take part in the decision-making processes. So another, talking about progresses, another point is about youth-led campaigns, which has been successfully able to aware people about gender equality, bodily autonomy, and feminist agendas like sexual and reproductive health rights in Nepal. And I think in Nepal, SRHR movement is led by youth organizations. So there are other feminist agendas which are being facilitated by senior feminist organizations, but talking about sexual and reproductive health rights, I think young people and youth-led organizations are leading this movement in Nepal, which is, I think, a big progress. Another is implementation of youth-centered programs and initiatives that has integrated bodily autonomy, human rights, gender equality, and sexual and reproductive health rights. There are a lot of youth-led campaigns and youth-centered programs which are being run and initiated by government as well, of course, through our advocacy agendas. Another is development of innovation, technology, and digital platforms strategy to amplify youth voices and mobilize advocacy efforts for promotion of human rights, SRHR, and gender equality. This is particularly during the COVID era and post-COVID era, we have been seeing a lot of young people engaging in digital advocacy, especially through TikTok, Instagram Live, and Facebook Live, and we have been seeing a lot of digital engagement when it comes to gender equality and sexual and reproductive health rights. So we also see a strengthened partnership between youth organizations, government bodies, and international agencies. So platforms like Youth Council and then CAC advocacy coalitions are a great example of UN agencies, partnership between UN agencies, youth organization, and government stakeholders. So these are all the progresses that we have been seeing in our region and in our country when it comes to successful youth advocacy intervening in SRHR and gender equality arena. Now talking about the barriers, so there is a persistent patriarchal values, gender norms, and cultural barriers, which has hindered our progress towards achieving gender equality. I think this is very common all over the world, and especially in South Asia, where there is a very grave patriarchal norms ingrained in all of our brain, which has really made it difficult for us to progress towards gender equality. And another is a lack of adequate funding and resources, particularly for the youth-led advocacy and programs. Even it is difficult for us to access allocated funding from the government because, I don't know, there is a gap between government and youth-led organizations. Maybe it's because of the age-based discrimination or norms. And another is definitely tokenism and limited and superficial participation of youth participation. Though young people are being invited in those government forums and civil society forums, but still our voices are not well recognized, and tokenism is definitely still a problem. Another is lack of technical assistance and capacity building opportunities for young people, especially to participate in UN human rights mechanisms. Young people particularly lack knowledge on about these platforms, and there is very limited capacity building programs when it comes to international advocacy programs for young people. And also the law and policies and the processes to meaningfully participate in these spaces is very technical, and the language is very difficult for young people to understand. Another is there is a disparity in SRHR services and information access, especially when it comes to marginalized people. For example, people who don't speak mainstream Nepali language and people with disabilities, because our hospitals and clinics are not accessible for diverse forms of disabilities. And it is also very difficult for unmarried people, young sex workers, young people who use drug. It's very difficult for these marginalized people to access SRHR services. And we also lack comprehensive data and researches to support the initiatives and applications of human-centric design in initiatives. These are the barriers. Now I'd like to move forward with the actionable recommendations. So what should we continue? We should continue fostering collaboration between youth organizations, government, and international bodies to support and scale up successful gender equality and sexual and reproductive health rights initiatives. Additionally, we should continue to support youth organizations and young people in engage at all stages of human rights reviews, from the beginning to the end. And we should continue funding youth initiatives and maintain the use of innovation, digital tools, and social media. And of course, we should strive to address the digital divide that has been existing for a long time. And what should we stop? What should be stopped? We should stop the superficial involvement of young people in policy making and ensure their participation is meaningful and recognized as essential to advancing human rights and gender equality. And of course, intersectionality should also be ensured while ensuring meaningful youth participation. And we should stop implementing one-size-fits-all approaches that fail to consider local cultural context and intersectionality. And we should we should tailor advocacy efforts to promote gender equality and sexual and reproductive health rights within the broader human rights agenda. So what should we start? So an enabling environment should be prepared so that young people can meaningfully participate and contribute in UN human rights platforms where we can be in the decision-making table and contribute our experiences with regards to gender equality and sexual and reproductive health rights. And enact and enforce laws that explicitly protect and promote bodily autonomy and gender equality, ensuring these rights are recognized as fundamental human rights. Because if sexual and reproductive health rights and gender equality are ingrained in the fundamental rights, then it will be very easy for youth advocacy to foster. So there are only few countries in Asia Pacific region which has ingrained which has incorporated gender equality and sexual and reproductive health rights in its fundamental rights, including Nepal and Philippines, I think. So I think all the countries in the Asia Pacific region and the world should incorporate these issues as fundamental rights. Another is ensure that gender equality is recognized as a prerequisite for achieving all the sustainable development goals and as a cross-cutting human rights issue, because gender equality is not a isolated issue. It is a cross-cutting issue and should be applicable in all SDGs, including climate change, conflict, peace, and everything. And at last, I'd like to say that that laws and policies, they should definitely be gender responsive, but what we should really strive for is structural change and systemic change, because as long as there is a hegemony of patriarchal norms, we will not be able to fight queerphobia, sexism, misogyny, and gender equality. So with punitive measures, we should also go for structural remedies. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pushpa, and I cannot agree more coming from the same context and background. And thank you also for highlighting some of the progresses made, because, as we understand that the progresses are being made, we are also urging for the progresses to be sustained and as dynamic as the young population themselves. So next we move on to Shane Patla. Shane is from Thailand and is a non-binary disabled activist with 8 years of experience in LGBTIQ+ rights, climate change, and disability justice. Dear Shane, please share with us more on protection of the human rights defenders and young advocates.
Okay, so this will be a little bit different from what you've been hearing today. We'll be talking about you specifically, and human rights defenders in general, and youth advocates in general. So there are some progresses that have been made in our region. A lot of it is, well, not in our region specifically, but in Thailand. We have had like more positive attitudes about mental health provisions for human rights defenders. So more and more organizations are actually providing mental health care to their staff and for their well-being. And there's also a well-being fund that is set aside by many organizations in this sense. There's also been progressive laws that have been passed. Marriage equality bill, for example, in our region, Nepal, Thailand, also Taiwan. But another thing is Thailand's commitment to marriage equality, gender recognition, and legalizing sex work. While some of these attitudes are really positive, it doesn't necessarily translate into action. We still don't see a lot of human rights defenders actually receiving mental health care, for one, that they desperately need. We're essentially a country where we have 1.28 psychiatrists and 1.57 psychologists for every 100,000 people. And this number is even smaller for marginalized communities that require very personalized interventions. And another thing is like, while progressive laws and bills have been passed, many governments are also regressing into really conservative spaces, whether it's for pro-democracy movements or otherwise. For example, the Thai government at the moment has been uprooted and turned upside down. Our prime minister was recently dismissed, and we have a new prime minister. This is probably, and it's not the person that we voted into parliament. So we've now changed like 3 prime ministers in the past year. Malaysia has it too, apparently. There are more prides around the world than ever, which is really good, with over 100 countries celebrating Pride at the moment. But while all of these progressions affect human rights defenders and young people positively and give us hope for the future, there's still a lot of work to be done. If we look at barriers that we've encountered over the years and over the decades that we've been working in this region, in this space, one of the things that we've seen a lot, especially with pro-democracy political activists, are forced disappearances, reprisals from governments. Human rights defenders are also targeted in a much higher percentage, where 30% actually lose their lives because of forced disappearances. They end up, well, one of the recent cases was political activists ended up dead in the borders of Thailand, and no one knew exactly what happened. And there is no investigations done in order to figure that out either, because investigations are done through the government. There's also regressive anti-CSO bills that affect how nonprofits and civil society organizations operate in our region, which basically means the government gets to control what funding goes into the CSOs and nonprofits, right? There's also a lot of funding landscape changes, which basically means a lot of donors, very big donors like Open Societies Foundation, for one, have been pulling out money from our region and putting it into the US and into global north countries instead. We've also seen poor treatment of political prisoners, many of whom are young human rights defenders. And we've had conservative group pushback, especially in the deep south of Thailand. One of the biggest things that I've noticed from my peers in Thailand is that we have the highest burnout rate when we're working in this space, and we're also very severely underpaid. I've spoken to so many activists who work with me, and 40% of them are working for free. And a lot of grassroots organizations don't even have funding to meet their operations costs month to month. So this is awful. Like, I don't even know how they are operating or even paying for their day-to-day expenses. Bullying of human rights defenders online is also another thing, which also comes with ableist, homophobic, and transphobic language. So jumping into recommendations, I think one of the biggest thing is to stop reprisals against human rights defenders. And there's no way the UN can help us in this. There's only one way, and it is to hold our governments accountable and for transparency, right? Expressing a political view should not be met with reprisals from state or any other governmental party. Human rights defenders should also have the right to peaceful protest without the fear of losing their lives or incarceration. So laws like lèse majesté, which is a criminal code section 112, which is essentially criminalizing saying anything ill about the monarchy in Thailand, should be repealed entirely. Human rights defenders should also have the right to bail and protection while incarcerated. At the moment, they are being treated in a very, very inhumane manner. Another recommendations is in the continue part. So the next one, thank you. So better mental health care and legal representation for human rights defenders is very, very important. More mental health care provisions is necessary for human rights defenders and young people, and more accessible mental health care, which basically means financially accessible and easier to find. Hope is also a powerful tool which ignites motivation in all of us, and progressive laws give us that. Also, governments that come out in support of what we're fighting for also gives us hope. Legal representation and knowledge are also the backbone of our movements. Improving legal competency of young human rights defenders is really, really important. So knowing what laws are necessary to get us away from, for example, police brutality, right? Another thing is mutual aid and mutual funding. Finally, that there are some things that we need to start. So for example, introducing laws that will actually protect human rights defenders from reprisals from state parties, and to ratify the 2 UN processes that will actually support human rights defenders. Another thing that I really believe in is to train authorities on nonviolent de-escalation techniques and provide training on abuse of power and the use of brutal force. We see this a lot happening in the US, and this is also happening in our own countries. We saw that happening in Bangladesh too, right? Recently, right? Okay, and then we see that happening in Myanmar, we see that happening in Thailand. This is a very common thing all across the globe. Third thing and final thing is to bring young people and human rights defenders to the forefront of policymaking about our protection. Because we know best what we need. And when I say bring them to the forefront, I don't just mean in a tokenistic way and putting us on the table, listening to us, and then ignoring us after. I mean from the beginning to the end of creating charters, of creating policy, of listening to us, giving us a space, and not just 2 minutes at HRC, like HRC, whatever, right? Actually mean taking our considerations into, taking our recommendations into consideration. Thank you. Do not scan that. I got told this afternoon that was expired. So please feel free to add me on LinkedIn or on Instagram. Thanks.
Thank you, Sheet, for that. Next, we move on to Anvesha. So Anvesha Chatterjee is from India and is a queer feminist activist and social worker from India with an expertise of working with survivors of gender-based violence and sexual and reproductive rights. She is currently the Deputy Director at Sahyog, which is a community-based organization working on SRHR and gender justice in Lucknow, India.
Hi. Okay, so I think I'm the last speaker, so I'm hoping I have you here because the thing that I want to talk about is sexual and reproductive justice and intersectionalities. And before I start my presentation, I want to talk about 2 things which I would request, implore that we as representatives of our different our communities, as different organizations, as different forums, keep it in our mind. First is intersectionality, intersectionality, and intersectionality. Although we do talk about the progress that is happening in our region, we need to really ask the question, who is the progress for? Who is, like, for whom is the facilities reaching? Who are being left out? So these are the three questions that we need to always keep in our mind, and this is the lens that we need to actually bring out in our analysis, in our advocacy, in our program design, and as well as in our program implementation. Secondly, I think I take from Siva's presentation that we do talk about the bread, but we forget to sometimes talk about the roses. So while we talk in the SRHR landscape, while we do talk about sexual and reproductive health, we often forget to talk about sexual and reproductive rights, and especially through the lens of autonomy, choice, and self-determination. So in my presentation, I don't have a separate progress and barriers presentation. I speak about these two aspects, sexual and reproductive health. So in that, I will talk about the progress as well as the barriers. And then in sexual and reproductive rights, I will speak about the progress and barriers along with the recommendations. I also want to mention that I'm speaking in terms of India specifically, but I'm sure a lot of these things that I'm talking about, you will be able to find some level of similarity in your regional context as well. So if we talk about sexual and reproductive health, in India, there has been a lot of advancement made in reducing maternal mortality. But we also need to focus on the fact that for younger people, especially for adolescents or young women who are choosing or who are pregnant, the maternal mortality is higher. So again, when the governments and everyone and the CSOs are talking about that we have contributed to reducing maternal mortality, we need to really question that, are we reducing maternal mortality for all across the board, for different castes, for different religions? So that is something that I wanted to put forth. So, and especially for antenatal and postnatal care for specifically poor and minority women is quite low in India. Secondly, anemia is something which continues to be a huge problem in the Indian subcontinent, with over 50 to 60% of women of reproductive age suffering from anemia. And just also a point to be added that the government of India will from the next cycle stop recording or collecting data on anemia prevalence, which is a very huge setback for us, because without data, we will not be able to advocate for better services and for better reach. Thirdly, if we speak about contraception, there's a huge unmet need for contraception, and for younger people, which is basically young girls from the age of 15 to 19 and 20 to 24 years of age, the unmet need for contraception is 22% higher than married women. Similarly, if we look at the abortion laws, though India has a very progressive on paper abortion law, which from a very rights-based perspective, but if we look at the ground level data and the community data that is coming out, there's a huge stigma and inaccessibility of abortion services, and especially post-abortion care. And this is specifically for unmarried and minor girls and women. And of course, more in rural areas. Okay, sorry. There's also a lack of access to health facilities. So especially because I'm speaking about younger people, only around 29% of those aged 15 to 19 and around 40% of those aged 20 to 24 are able to even access or go to a health facility on their own. We realize what it means for SRHR when you're not being able to get that privacy if you're discussing about SRHR. Lastly, I will just skip a few points, but the attitude and behavior of service providers, especially for minority women, women who are Dalits, women who are Muslims, is very disrespectful and judgmental. Please, next slide. If we look at sexual and reproductive rights now and gender-based violence, we see that right to choice, which is the roses which Siva talks about, is very restricted in India, and this becomes even more difficult when it's intercaste or interreligious partnerships or marriages. Secondly, there's also a huge criminalization of consensual adolescent or youth sexuality. And this is also not just at a community or a stigma or a thought level restriction, but it's also a legal restriction. Thirdly, there's a huge contraceptive burden on women, and only 1 or 2% of men use contraceptives, or although they are more aware about the basket of choices, but the usage of contraceptive services is less. Lastly, there's high rates of sexual violence that we are seeing in India right now, which is connected to the rise of an aggressive, nationalistic masculinity that we are seeing in the government. And there's a huge backlash for gender rights work, and there's a defunding of gender rights work and attacking of CBOs and CSOs who are working in the community. And although homosexuality was decriminalized after a lot of struggle in 2018, there is still no marriage equality. Our Supreme Court recently heard a marriage equality judgment, and they refused to give us that right. And there's no right to adopt, there's no right for, and it's very difficult to access abortion services for queer individuals. And there's a huge level of violence from police and family systems for queer persons. There's also no recognition of intimate partner violence in queer relationships. And lastly, I think similar to what Shane shared, there's a huge rise in technology-facilitated gender-based violence, especially against women human rights defenders, women and queer human rights defenders who are voicing their opinions in the out. I'll move forward to the recommendations. We need to integrate comprehensive sexuality education in school curriculum, especially the public schooling system. Secondly, it's very important to engage young men through the lens of developing positive masculinity and equal responsibility. Thirdly, I tell this again and again, we need to collect disaggregated data. This is especially crucial in India's context because we have not had a census in the last 12, 13 years. So unless we collect disaggregated data, we will not be able to understand intersectionalities, cannot design programs, cannot advocate. Lastly, we need to start investing in community-centered organizations because these are the organizations who have the most direct reach to people who are far away from the mainstream. What we need to continue is we need to continue the proper implementation and resource allocation to health programs focused on youth. In India, on paper, we do have a very solid youth and adolescent health policy, but it suffers from very poor implementation and resource allocation. Secondly, we need to continue training frontline health workers who are the people who are reaching the communities in the rural areas or the far to reach areas so that they prioritize the choice and autonomy and privacy that you need in providing SRH services. And in terms of stopping, we definitely need to stop criminalizing adolescent and youth sexuality, consensual youth sexuality in policies, in our social and behavior change modules, and also in our pop culture. Secondly, we need to stop defunding gender rights work. And thirdly, we need to stop making top-down policies which has no youth representation. So thank you, everyone, and Zindabad.
Thank you so much, Anvesha. That brings us to the end of our panel. As much as we'd like to take some questions, I'm also aware of the time constraints, and we've already taken up your 25 minutes of lunch hour. So if there are any burning questions that you need to address to the panelists, maybe one. Okay, we just have one hand. I think we can take that question.
Hello. Hello. My name is Hamishal Mubarak. You can call me.
We cannot hear you kindly.
Okay. All right. My name is Hamishal Mubarak. I'm representing Intimuja, Indonesia, from Indonesia. So, Indonesia's political condition right now is not really good. As of we are talking about SRHR Summit of the Future back in Indonesia, the House of Representatives of the Republic of Indonesia is now passing the new bills on renewing the standard, lowering the standardization of the candidate for regional leaders. and it is stripped of our democratic rights in that manner. And it is also supporting the creation of President Jokowi's political dynasty, since their sons also running for the position. So yeah, it is. I would like to say thank you to Shane to mentioning about the brutal decriminalization of police officer and any officer to human rights defender, because right now Indonesia is in riot because of that, and a lot of my friends is also decriminalized because of that. And well, just my question is, as an advocate for young population, we and a grassroots community in Indonesia, we are actually facing a very common, let's say very common, because organization is also facing about financial instability, and while some country probably they are already set aside some money to fund program for youth and SRHR, but none of them allocated in the right way, and it is typically quite difficult for small grassroots community to access that kind of money. So my question is, how do you is there any strategic way to to make sure that that kind of money that international organization and country that already set aside to be allocated to the right grassroots community, because they are grassroots and we need to support them, and none of them, like some of them probably don't have the qualification, that high standard of qualification to
I'm so sorry
lot
for
of
cutting in.
can
but-
match the standardization. I'm sorry. Yeah. How do you address that kind of issue? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. Anyone from the panelists would like to take that question? The question is, any strategies, best practices around allocation of resources for grassroots level organizations? I think it's still in a trial phase, and we're still trying to see what the best strategies would be for now. So that brings us to the end of the session. I understand that there might be many more questions as well, but they can also go to the walls as well, and we will revisit them. We promise that we will revisit them in the call to action as well. And for now, thank you so much, dear panelists, for sharing your insights, your experiences, your recommendations, and thank you so much for keeping up with us during the lunch hours as well. So over to you, Ranjita Devi. Thank you.
Thank you for this amazing panel. We'll now be going for lunch. We'll be back for our sessions at 2 p.m. But before going to the lunch, I would like